Welcome back to Beyond the Darkness. Tonight, we're diving into the heart of Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog rolls in heavy and the woods hide things that should never be seen. Get ready for 4 true creepy encounters from Kentucky. Stories that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. So, let's get started. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Jack, an avid camper and hiker, made his way toward Mossy Hollow. He had heard stories from locals about the strange happenings in the area, but they were nothing more than campfire tales to him. A seasoned outdoorsman, Jack had spent years hiking through remote forests, exploring abandoned trails, and camping in places most people avoided. Mossy Hollow seemed like the perfect place to spend a quiet night alone, away from the noise of civilization. His backpack was packed with all the essentials: food, water, a sleeping bag, and his trusty flashlight. He had mapped out the area and knew that Mossy Hollow was a secluded part of the forest, cut off by thick foliage and steep hills. The hollow itself was a natural basin, surrounded by towering trees and a moss-covered floor that gave it its name. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine as Jack made his way deeper into the hollow. By the time he set up camp near an old quarry, the light had nearly faded completely, and the temperature began to drop. He stoked a small fire, the flames crackling and casting long shadows against the trees. The sound of the crackling wood was the only noise in the otherwise quiet forest. Jack sat back in his camping chair, a hot cup of coffee in hand, and gazed up at the stars. It was peaceful, too peaceful. After a long day of hiking, Jack had grown used to the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl. But tonight, there was nothing. Not a single animal stirred. The stillness was oppressive, almost unnatural. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over him. It was probably just the isolation getting to him. After all, he had been hiking alone for days now. As the darkness deepened, the firelight flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Jack couldn't help but feel that something was watching him from the edge of the camp, lurking just beyond the fire's reach. He glanced nervously into the trees but saw nothing. The wind rustled the leaves above him, but there was no sign of life. That was when he heard it, a soft tapping noise. At first, Jack thought it was just a branch falling, or maybe a squirrel scampering through the underbrush. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound echoing through the hollow. It seemed to come from all directions, filling the air, as if it were moving closer. Jack's heart rate quickened. He stood up from his chair, his flashlight in hand, and scanned the area. The tapping continued, accompanied now by a low, guttural noise, like the shuffle of feet on the ground. "Hello?" Jack called into the dark, his voice shaking slightly. There was no response, only the continuing tapping and the shuffle of unseen feet. Jack's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his pack, pulled out his knife, and approached the source of the sound. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. It could be another camper, or maybe some lost hikers. But something told him that wasn't the case. The tapping grew louder, and Jack's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the outline of several figures in the distance. They were marching toward him, moving in perfect synchrony, their feet hitting the ground with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic precision. Jack froze. The figures were draped in tattered clothing, and their movements were stiff and unnatural. Their heads were bowed, faces obscured by tangled hair or the shadow of their hoods. As they neared, the moonlight illuminated their forms, and Jack's stomach twisted. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, were empty, dark voids, and their faces were gaunt, like those of the long dead. Jack's breath caught in his throat as they continued to move forward, their eyes never shifting, never blinking. The tap-tap-tap of their feet was now joined by a low, resonant chant, like a distant drumbeat, growing louder with every step. The figures seemed to glide over the ground, their legs moving with an eerie, jerking rhythm that looked unnatural. His first instinct was to run. His legs were ready to carry him back to the safety of his tent, but something held him rooted to the spot. The figures had surrounded him now, their presence suffocating, their chanting growing louder until it seemed to echo through the very air around him. The fire, which had been crackling moments before, now sputtered, its flames dimming as the temperature dropped. A thick fog began to roll in from the forest, curling around the edges of the camp like a serpent. The fog clung to Jack's boots, making the air thick with an icy chill. He looked around, desperate for any sign of escape, but the figures were everywhere, closing in on him from all sides. "Who are you?" Jack shouted, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figures didn't answer. Their march continued, slow and deliberate, as though they were marching to some ancient, forgotten rhythm that only they could hear. The chant filled the air, and Jack realized with a growing sense of horror that it was in a language he didn't recognize, a language that seemed to seep into his bones, making his head spin. His heartbeat hammered in his chest as he turned to make a run for it. But before he could take a step, a sharp pain shot through his leg. He looked down in confusion, only to see a shadowy hand, its fingers long and bony, wrapped around his ankle. The fingers seemed to stretch out from the fog, grabbing hold of him with a vice-like grip. Jack kicked, trying to free himself, but the grip tightened, pulling him down to the ground. He could feel the coldness of the hand seep into his skin, a numbness spreading through his body. The figures continued their march, their chant growing louder, almost deafening. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision began to blur as the fog thickened around him, enveloping him completely. The last thing he saw before everything went black were the figures, still marching in perfect unison, their faces now inches from his, their empty eyes staring down at him. Jack awoke to darkness. His head throbbed with pain, and his body felt stiff, as though it had been frozen in place for hours. The world around him was suffocatingly silent. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and he realized that he was no longer in his campsite. Instead, he was lying on the cold, damp ground, surrounded by the thick fog that had rolled in earlier. The air was heavy, and the temperature had dropped sharply. His breath fogged in front of him as he sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked several times, trying to clear the fog from his mind. But the fear from the previous night clung to him like a shroud. The figures, the night marchers, they had surrounded him, their chanting filling the air. And then, nothing. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the events that had led to his current situation. Had he blacked out? Had they done something to him? A low groan escaped his lips as he stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. His pack and gear were gone, along with the fire and his tent. He looked around, but the landscape was eerily unfamiliar. The trees seemed taller now, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in every direction. There was no sign of the night marchers, no trace of the figures that had once surrounded him. His throat was dry, and his chest ached from the cold. Jack stumbled forward, his legs weak and unsteady. He tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat, weak and hoarse. He hadn't felt like this before. He had faced all kinds of challenges in the wilderness, but this was different. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against him. He moved slowly through the mist, his eyes darting around, half expecting the figures to appear out of the fog at any moment. The silence was maddening. It was as though the entire forest had been swallowed by the fog, leaving him isolated, alone. Every step he took seemed to be swallowed by the thick, suffocating air, and he felt the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing second. Then, the sound came again. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling in the distance. But as Jack continued walking, it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound of footsteps just beyond the fog growing nearer. His heart skipped a beat. The night marchers. They were coming for him again. Jack's body froze. His instinct screamed at him to run, to flee from the sound that was steadily growing louder. But his legs wouldn't move. The tapping was accompanied by a low, haunting chant, just as it had been before. It was faint at first, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees, but it soon became more distinct, more deliberate. He couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of the chant was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and ominous. It seemed to echo through the very fog that surrounded him, filling the air with an oppressive weight. His chest tightened, and his breath quickened. Not again," Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the growing chant. "Please, not again." The tapping grew louder, and Jack could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and measured, closing in on him from all sides. He turned in every direction, but there was nothing in sight. Just the thick, swirling fog and the eerie sounds of the marchers moving through it. A shiver ran down his spine as the fog parted slightly, revealing a figure. One of the marchers. It was standing just beyond the mist, its outline obscured by the fog. But Jack could make out the tattered clothing, the long, gnarled limbs, and the same haunting, unblinking eyes that had been burned into his memory. It stood motionless, as if waiting for him to approach. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as the figure slowly raised its head, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. The chanting grew louder, and Jack could feel the weight of the voices pressing against him, filling his mind with an oppressive, suffocating force. Without thinking, Jack turned and ran. His legs burned as he pushed himself forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog twisted around him, disorienting him, but he kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. The tapping sound echoed behind him, a constant rhythmic presence that made his blood run cold. He glanced over his shoulder. The figures were moving, stepping out of the fog, one after another. They were marching in perfect unison, their movements deliberate and synchronized, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The closer they came, the more their chanting seemed to fill the air, wrapping around him like a dark, unshakable fog. Jack's panic surged. He couldn't outrun them. He knew that. They were everywhere, closing in on him, their pace never faltering, their chanting growing louder and louder. His legs were burning, his lungs aching, but there was no escape. As he ran, he saw something in the distance, a faint glow, like a light shining through the fog. His mind grasped at it, desperate for anything that might offer a way out. It was a campsite. His campsite. He sprinted toward it, his breath ragged and desperate. The figures were still coming, their footsteps heavy, their presence closing in on him. He had to reach the fire. He had to get there before they caught him. He reached the campsite, his body collapsing to the ground as he stumbled to a stop. The fire was still burning, though it was faint, its light flickering weakly in the mist. His gear was there, his pack, his tent, everything he had left behind. But something was wrong. The air around the campsite was thick, too thick, as if it were alive, pressing in on him. He turned to face the fog, and there they were. The figures stood at the edge of the campsite, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. They didn't move, but their presence filled the space, suffocating him. The tapping had stopped. The chanting had stopped. Everything had stopped, except for their eyes. They were waiting, watching, and Jack knew in that moment that they were not just marching, they were claiming. And now, it was his turn. Jack's mind raced as he stumbled backward toward the fire. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. The figures were still standing at the edge of the campsite, their hollow eyes fixed on him, watching his every movement. The chanting had ceased, but the silence was suffocating, heavy with an ancient, oppressive energy that seemed to thicken the very air around him. He could feel their gaze on him, cold, unblinking, and relentless. And the sensation was more than just physical. It was as if their eyes were pressing into his mind, worming their way into his thoughts, whispering things he couldn't understand. The sound of his heartbeat was deafening in his ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, Jack thought he might collapse right there, overcome by the overwhelming weight of fear. But then he saw it, his pack, sitting just a few feet from the fire. He could barely make out the shape of his flashlight and knife, still resting where he'd left them. His fingers twitched at the thought of grabbing them. He knew it would be futile. The figures hadn't moved yet, but their presence alone was paralyzing. The forest felt alive with a dark energy, pressing in on him from all sides. There was no escape from the nightmare that surrounded him. But then, from the fog beyond the figures, a new sound emerged, a low, eerie sound that cut through the silence like a blade. It was a rhythmic thumping, heavy and deliberate, as if something immense was moving through the fog. The ground beneath Jack's feet seemed to tremble with each pulse of the sound, and he could feel the vibrations travel up through his legs, rattling his bones. The figures didn't react. They stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening to the sound, but they didn't move. Jack's chest tightened with panic, his hands clenched into fists as he took a step back. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just a single thump anymore. It was a series of thumps, like the sound of heavy footsteps, shaking the earth itself. The fog thickened, swirling in response to the thumping sound, as if something or someone was coming toward him. Jack's eyes scanned the fog desperately, his heart racing in his chest. What was it? What was out there? Then, through the mist, he saw it. A massive figure, its silhouette looming over the trees, moving slowly but with terrifying purpose. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible in the swirling fog. As it moved closer, Jack could make out the shape of what looked like tattered, ancient armor, its form so large that it seemed to block out the light from the fire. The figure's head was obscured by a dark, hooded cloak, and the eerie sound of its steps reverberated in Jack's chest. Jack's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. This was no ordinary figure. It was something ancient, something that had been lost to time, and it was moving toward him with a force that seemed unstoppable. The night marchers were not the only ones here. The massive figure stepped forward, its feet sinking into the ground, as if the earth itself was yielding to it. The thumping grew louder with each step, the force of its presence vibrating through Jack's body. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen, weighed down by the heavy air and the unearthly presence surrounding him. The figure raised its head, and Jack caught a fleeting glimpse of its face, or rather, what should have been its face. It was a hollow void, a black, empty space where eyes should have been, and Jack could feel the coldness of its gaze, even though it had no eyes to speak of. With a sudden, jarring motion, the figure raised its arm, pointing directly at Jack. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy, and for a moment, everything went still. The fog thickened, the trees swaying as if in response to the figure's command. Then, the figures, the night marchers, began to move. They stepped forward in perfect unison, their slow, deliberate march closing the distance between them and Jack. Their heads remained bowed, their eyes fixed on the ground as they moved, but their presence was suffocating. Jack's heart raced as they surrounded him, the chanting beginning again, low and rhythmic, filling the air with an unnatural, almost hypnotic force. The figure that had pointed at him began to move as well, its slow, deliberate steps echoing through the mist. Its body seemed to shift, the dark cloak swirling around it like smoke, and its form seemed to stretch, to bend, as though it was not entirely bound by the laws of nature. As it moved closer, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every step it took. Jack's mind reeled. What were they? What did they want from him? His thoughts were a blur of fear and confusion, his body frozen in place as the night marchers continued their slow, deliberate advance. The leader, the massive figure, stopped just in front of him. Its hollow face was mere inches from Jack's, and he could feel the icy breath of it, a cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, as if urging Jack to surrender, to accept whatever fate awaited him. Jack couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy with the weight of their presence. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, to break free of their hold. But his body wouldn't respond. Then, the leader spoke, its voice like a distant thunderclap, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. "You are the one who disturbs the silence," it said, its voice an ancient echo that sent chills down Jack's spine. "You do not belong here. You were never meant to walk these woods." Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as the figure's words sank in. He had crossed a boundary, a threshold into something ancient and forgotten. The night marchers, the massive figure, they weren't just spirits. They were protectors of something that Jack had unknowingly disturbed. And now, there was no turning back. With a sudden, violent motion, the figure raised its arm, and the ground beneath Jack's feet seemed to shudder. He could feel the earth tremble, as though the very foundation of the world was being altered. The mist grew thicker, swirling around him, and for a brief moment, Jack was engulfed in darkness, and then it was gone. Jason had been driving for what felt like hours, the steady hum of the car's engine blending with the occasional chirp of crickets as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had taken a detour through Foggy Gap, a shortcut that promised to shave off an hour of driving on his way to a meeting in the city. He had heard locals warn him about the gap, speaking of strange occurrences and thick fog that often enveloped the road. But Jason had always brushed off such tales as just superstitions. The night had been clear, and the road was empty, stretching out in front of him like a ribbon of dark asphalt. The road was narrow, winding between towering trees that grew so thick on either side, it was as if they were closing in around him. The air had begun to grow cooler, and Jason couldn't help but notice how unnervingly quiet it had become. The usual sounds of the countryside, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, were absent. Instead, there was a strange, unnatural stillness, a silence that pressed against his eardrums. Jason glanced at his GPS again. According to the device, he had about 10 miles to go before he rejoined the main highway. But as he glanced at the road ahead, a sudden fog began to roll in. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the road was clear, and the next, the fog had descended, thick and heavy, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He slowed the car, his headlights barely cutting through the dense mist. But the further he drove, the thicker it seemed to get. The trees, now shadows, loomed on either side of him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. Jason turned on his high beams, but they didn't help much. The fog seemed to swallow the light, creating an eerie sense of disorientation. He felt like he was driving through an endless void, where time and space didn't seem to exist. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of the highway ahead, no sign of civilization. Then, as he turned a sharp bend, he saw something in the distance. A figure standing just off the side of the road. Jason's breath caught in his throat. At first, he thought it might be an illusion, a trick of the fog playing with his senses. But as he drove closer, he could make out the outline of a woman. She was standing motionless, her back turned toward him, facing the dense woods. She wore a tattered coat, her hair long and wild, falling loosely around her shoulders. Her posture was unnervingly stiff, like a statue frozen in time. Jason's first instinct was to stop and offer help, but something held him back. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the car rolled to a slow stop, just a few feet from the figure. He wasn't sure why, but there was something unsettling about the woman's stillness, about the way she stood there, unmoving, as if she didn't even notice the passing vehicle. He honked his horn softly, hoping to get her attention. The sound echoed eerily in the fog, but she didn't flinch. She didn't turn, didn't even acknowledge him. Jason's mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. She had to be real, didn't she? "Hey, are you okay?" Jason called out, his voice tinged with uncertainty. For a moment, the only response was the unsettling silence that stretched between them. But then, just as he was about to drive on, the woman slowly turned around. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at him. There was something wrong with her eyes, something empty, as if they held no recognition of the world around her. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Are you all right?" he asked again, but his voice faltered as the woman took a slow, deliberate step toward the road. The fog seemed to move with her, swirling around her form like a veil. For a moment, the woman didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at him, her unblinking eyes never leaving his. Jason felt an overwhelming urge to drive away, to speed past her and get out of the fog, but something kept him rooted in place. Then, in a voice as soft and cold as the mist itself, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come this way," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as though each one was being forced from her mouth. "It's not safe here." Jason's breath caught in his throat, and his mind raced. "What do you mean? I'm just trying to get to the highway. What's going on?" The woman's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You're too late," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The fog is already here, and it will keep you forever." Jason's pulse quickened. Something about her words, the way she spoke them, sent a chill down his spine. He glanced nervously at the road ahead, but all he could see was the thick, impenetrable fog, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Suddenly, the woman took another step forward, her eyes never leaving his. The fog parted just enough to reveal something else. Figures moving slowly in the distance, just beyond the edge of the road. They were dressed in old, tattered clothing, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their movements jerky and unnatural. As they stepped forward, more and more of them appeared, emerging from the fog like shadows. Jason's breath hitched in his chest. The figures seemed to be moving in sync, their slow, deliberate march toward him sending waves of terror through his body. They weren't just walking, they were closing in on him, surrounding him. The woman stepped back into the fog, her figure disappearing just as suddenly as it had appeared. Jason's mind raced as he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as he tried to escape the growing number of figures. But no matter how fast he drove, the fog seemed to close in around him, thickening, swallowing the road ahead. The figures continued to march, their footsteps growing louder, more pronounced, until it felt as though the very air was vibrating with their presence. Jason's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his heart pounding as the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of him. There was no escape from the fog, no way to outrun the strange figures that followed him, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the fog lifted. Jason blinked in disbelief. The road was clear, the trees on either side once again visible. The figures were gone. The woman was gone. The world around him was quiet, still. He looked around, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been in his head? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? He didn't know. He only knew that the fog had returned to the gap, and it wasn't going away. Whatever had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and forgotten was waiting for him in Foggy Gap. And no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, it would follow. Jason's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove through the now clear road, his mind spinning with confusion and dread. The fog had lifted, but the eerie feeling still lingered, thick in his chest. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting the figures to emerge from the mist once more. But there was nothing. No one. His foot remained heavy on the accelerator as he pushed the car faster, desperate to leave Foggy Gap behind. He needed to get back to the main highway, to safety. His nerves were shot, and the woman's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. The fog is already here, and it will keep you forever. He couldn't make sense of it. It felt like a warning, something dark, something ancient. And it was not meant to be ignored. Despite the road being clear, Jason's anxiety didn't subside. The weight of the silence pressed against him, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. He tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease, but it clung to him, refusing to let go. As the night grew darker, the mist in his thoughts began to clear, and Jason's rational side began to take over. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe the fog had played tricks on him. After all, people did say that Foggy Gap had a way of playing with your mind, especially after dark. But then, as if to mock his attempt at reasoning, the fog rolled back in. It wasn't sudden, more like the return of a distant memory. At first, the mist hovered along the edges of the road, thickening the further he drove. Jason thought it might be another brief patch of fog, something normal for these backwoods roads. But as he drove deeper, it came rolling in again, heavier this time, covering the road in an impenetrable blanket. His headlights barely made a dent in the dense haze. The car's engine hummed louder, the fog thickening around him like a suffocating cloak. The world outside the windshield had disappeared completely. He could no longer see the trees or the edge of the road. It was as if he were floating in the middle of a gray void. Jason's pulse quickened. He slammed on the brakes, slowing the car to a crawl, his eyes scanning the road ahead in a panic. But there was nothing, just the oppressive fog pressing against the windows. the dull hum of his car the only sound. Then, just like before, the tapping began. It was faint at first, just a soft, distant sound, almost like the faint patter of rain. Jason strained to hear it, trying to make out the source. But then it grew louder, sharper, more rhythmic, like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, closing in on him from all sides. His heart began to race. He had heard this before. He had heard it in the fog, in the hollow. The tapping was accompanied by something else this time. Whispers, soft at first, just a murmur beneath the sound of the footsteps. Jason's mind screamed at him to drive faster, to get away, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, with no sign of an end, no escape from the fog. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he saw a figure, a silhouette indistinct against the fog, standing motionless behind the car. Jason's pulse raced as he slammed his foot back on the accelerator, speeding up despite the thick fog. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The tapping and whispers grew louder now, surrounding him from all directions, as if the entire forest was alive, closing in around him. In the midst of the growing panic, a new sound broke through, the low rumble of an engine. Jason's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, his heart leaping in his chest as the shape of another vehicle appeared through the mist, growing closer at an alarming rate. His first instinct was relief. Maybe it was another driver, someone to help him. But as the car got closer, something felt wrong. The headlights were too bright, blinding in the fog, and the car was moving at an unnatural speed. Jason could hear the engine roar, revving louder, as the vehicle closed the gap between them. It was coming too fast, and Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. He glanced nervously ahead, the fog now so thick that he could barely make out the road. The car drew up beside him. It was old, battered, with a rusted body that seemed to merge with the darkness. The headlights were almost blinding, and the sound of the engine was deafening. The car's window was rolled down, and though Jason couldn't see the driver's face, the shadowy figure inside was unmistakable. It was moving with unnerving precision, matching Jason's speed as if it were attached to him, locked in sync. Before Jason could react, the figure in the other car turned its head. It was a man, gray, disheveled, with wild eyes that shone in the light of the headlights. He didn't smile. There was no expression, just an eerie stillness that seemed to send a chill through the very air between them. Then, the man raised his hand. He was holding something that glinted in the light. Jason's heart stopped as he realized what it was. A small, twisted charm, hanging from a string, swinging slightly in the motion of the man's hand. The man's lips moved, though no sound came from the other car. But Jason could hear the words, clear in his mind, as if the man's voice had been implanted there. "You cannot leave Foggy Gap." Before Jason could react, the figure in the car turned away, driving off into the thick fog without a sound, its engine fading into the distance. The tapping continued, but now it was joined by a low, mournful cry, like the wind whispering through a hollow. Jason's hands shook as he watched the car disappear into the mist, his pulse hammering in his chest. For a moment, the road was silent once again. The figure was gone. But the feeling, the overwhelming sense of something watching him, lingered. Jason couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. He glanced at the GPS again, but the screen was blank. The map had gone completely dark. The detour, the one that had seemed like such a harmless shortcut, was no longer on the map. The route he had taken seemed to vanish entirely, as if he were trapped in a space outside of time. And then, as if in answer to his dread, the tapping began again, louder than ever. Jason's hands were slick with sweat, as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. The fog continued to swirl around him like a living entity, pressing against the windows, suffocating everything in its path. The tapping sound had returned, louder this time, its rhythm now joined by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the car. He looked around, but the fog was so thick that the road ahead was nearly impossible to see. His headlights barely cut through it. He had no idea where he was anymore. The GPS had failed. The map on his phone had gone dark, and the last landmark he had passed was miles behind him. The road ahead seemed to stretch on into an endless void, and the more he tried to focus, the more disoriented he became. Every turn seemed to take him deeper into the fog, as if the road itself was shifting, twisting around him, guiding him into an inescapable labyrinth. His pulse was erratic, his thoughts racing. He couldn't explain what had happened with the car that had appeared beside him, the man with the strange charm, the eerie warning. "You cannot leave Foggy Gap." The words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Jason had heard rumors about the area, stories of strange occurrences, of people who disappeared without a trace. Their cars found days later on the side of the road with no sign of struggle. But this felt different. This felt like something far older, something beyond explanation. The tapping grew louder, the rhythmic sound almost hypnotic now. Jason's breath quickened. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had to do something. Anything to get out of this nightmare. Suddenly, the car lurched. The tires screeched as if they had hit something, the jolt throwing Jason forward in his seat. The fog seemed to part momentarily, revealing a figure in the road. It was standing motionless just beyond the beam of his headlights. The figure was tall, its body obscured by the thick fog, but Jason could make out the shape of a man, hunched over, his face hidden beneath a hood. He could barely see anything else, only the vague outline of a person, standing still in the middle of the road. Jason slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. His heart raced, and his hands trembled as he looked ahead, staring at the shadowy figure. The man didn't move. He was standing there, frozen, as if waiting for something. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps. "Hey! Move!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But the figure remained still, unmoving, as if it didn't hear him at all. The tension in the car was unbearable. Every fiber of Jason's being screamed at him to drive away, to put the figure behind him and get out of the fog. But he couldn't move. His car was stuck in place, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. Something in the back of his mind told him that the man wasn't human, that he was something else, something older, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. And then the figure moved. It was slow at first, its head turning toward Jason, the hood shifting with unnatural smoothness. The figure's face was obscured in shadow, but Jason could feel its eyes on him, piercing, cold, and unblinking. The fog thickened again, swirling around the figure like a cloak, obscuring it from view. The figure's head tilted, and Jason felt a chill run down his spine as a voice, soft but clear, whispered through the fog. "Why have you come here?" The voice was low, almost melodic, but it carried an undeniable weight, as though the words themselves had been spoken by something ancient. Jason's throat tightened. He could barely find his voice. I was just trying to get through. I didn't know." "You should not have come," the figure interrupted, its voice growing colder, sharper. "This place is not for you, not for those who walk in the light of the living." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct he had told him to get out of the car, to run as far and as fast as he could. But the fog, the The tapping, the figure, it all felt like some dark force was pulling him deeper into the heart of Foggy Gap, wrapping him in its cold, suffocating embrace. The figure took a step toward him, its movements deliberate, unnervingly slow. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as the figure's outline became clearer in the headlights, revealing long, gnarled hands, pale and twisted, like something not meant to exist in the realm of the living. The figure stepped closer, and Jason instinctively shifted the car into reverse, his foot pressing harder on the pedal. But the car wouldn't move. The tires spun helplessly against the road, as if the earth itself was holding him in place. Jason's heart skipped a beat, his pulse racing in his ears. He was trapped. The figure's head tilted again, its face still hidden in shadow. But Jason could feel its gaze upon him. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the car, pressing against his chest like a weight. "You are lost now," the figure whispered. "This road leads only to darkness." Jason's mind raced, his hands slick with sweat. He had to escape. He had to break free from this nightmare. But the figure was getting closer, its presence growing more oppressive with every step. Without thinking, Jason slammed his foot on the accelerator again, desperately trying to force the car backward. But the car jerked forward instead, lurching as though it were being pulled by an unseen force. The figure raised its hand. The mist around them seemed to pulse, and for a brief moment, the world outside the car went black. Jason's heart froze in his chest as he realized that the fog was not just thickening, it was closing in on him, trapping him in a bubble of darkness. The figure stepped closer, its hand outstretched as if to touch the car, to drag him out into the fog. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog parted. The figure was gone. Jason blinked, his breath coming in short gasps as the car jerked to a stop. The road ahead was clear now, the mist lifting like a veil that had been pulled back. For a moment, everything was still. There was no figure, no fog, no tapping, just the road, empty and silent. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to catch his breath. He was still alive. He was still in the car. The road was clear. But something had changed. Something had marked him. The tapping started again, and this time, it was louder than ever. David had been working as a maintenance technician for years, dealing with everything from broken streetlights to cracked pipes. But nothing had prepared him for what he found at Laurel Bend. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way part of town, nestled between two large, overgrown forests. Most of the roads there were old, forgotten by the town's expansion, but David had never thought much about it. He was used to working in the outskirts, repairing what was needed, and getting out as quickly as possible. But this time things were different. He was assigned to clear a service road in Laurel Bend that had been overgrown with ivy and brambles. The road had been barely used for years, and David wasn't sure why anyone had bothered to request maintenance. But it was his job, and he'd been doing it without question for a while now. The morning air was cool, a slight breeze rustling the trees around him as he made his way to the edge of the bend. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows through the thick trees. As he reached the service road, something struck him as odd. There were no signs of recent activity, no tracks, no tire marks, nothing to indicate that anyone had used the road recently. It was as though time itself had stopped on this stretch of land, leaving it to rot in isolation. The silence was unsettling, too. Normally, there would be birds, squirrels, or the rustle of leaves, but here, there was only the sound of his boots crunching on the dry earth. David took out his tools, and as he began clearing the brush from the road, something caught his eye in the distance. A gate. It was large, wrought iron, and stood at the far end of the road, almost hidden by thick undergrowth. The design was intricate, with strange patterns carved into the ironwork, patterns that seemed oddly familiar but unsettling at the same time. The gate wasn't marked, no signs or plaques indicating its purpose or origin. It was as though it had appeared out of nowhere, out of time. Curious, David decided to investigate. He walked toward the gate, pushing aside the tangled vines and branches that had overgrown it. As he got closer, he noticed something even stranger. There were no signs, no indicators of who owned the land beyond the gate, or why it had been left in such a state of neglect. The gate was old, rusted in places, but it was solid, as though it hadn't been touched in years. David reached for the gate's latch. As soon as his hand touched it, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the air, a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. His pulse quickened. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back. But the curiosity that had driven him to this point was too strong. He had to know what lay beyond the gate. He pulled the latch, and to his surprise, the gate creaked open easily, as though it hadn't been locked in years. The fog that had lingered in the distance seemed to move closer, swirling around the edges of the gate as if being drawn in by some unseen force. David stepped through the gate, his heart pounding. On the other side, the road was even more overgrown than it had been before. The trees were thicker, their branches intertwined to form a canopy so dense that only slivers of sunlight filtered through. The air felt colder here, and the ground seemed uneven, as if the earth itself had shifted in strange ways. As he walked further, David felt the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The only sound was the faint crunch of leaves beneath his boots. It was almost as though the world had disappeared, leaving him alone in a place that didn't belong in this time or space. And then he saw it. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was another gate. This one was even larger than the first, and it looked ancient. Its ironwork twisted into intricate, almost unnatural shapes. It stood alone, like a sentinel, as though guarding something hidden behind it. The air seemed to grow heavier the closer he got to the gate, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. David stopped in his tracks, a sense of dread settling over him. He had crossed the threshold of something, some unknown boundary, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. The gate loomed in front of him, its dark, swirling patterns almost hypnotic. The air felt thick, as if time itself had slowed, and the world around him felt distorted. As he stared at the gate, he saw something else. Figures, faint and barely visible, moving beyond it. Shadows, long and unnaturally tall, shifting slowly, like specters trapped in the fog. Their outlines were hazy, their movements slow and deliberate. For a brief moment, David thought he saw one of them turn toward him, its features obscured by the fog. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he took an instinctive step back, his eyes locked on the figures. They didn't move closer, but their presence felt oppressive, like an ancient force pressing in on him. The unease grew stronger, and David felt the weight of something unseen, something old and forgotten, watching him. He turned and started to walk back toward the first gate, but as he did, the path seemed to stretch longer, the trees growing taller around him. The fog thickened again, swirling around him, making it harder to see. The figures, if they were still there, had disappeared, but their presence lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't escape. When David finally reached the gate, he turned the latch to leave, but it wouldn't budge. The gate had closed behind him, locking him in. He tugged at the latch, frustration mounting. It was as if the gate had sealed itself, trapping him on the other side. The hum from earlier returned, a deep, vibrating sound that filled the air. Panic surged through him. He pulled harder at the latch, his muscles straining, but the gate wouldn't move. He looked around, the fog now so thick that he could barely make out the trees around him. The figures were gone, but he could still feel their presence, as if they were waiting just beyond the veil of fog. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to focus. He had to find another way out. As he stepped back, he noticed something strange, a small stone, half buried in the dirt at the base of the gate. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away, revealing a carved symbol. It was an intricate design, one he couldn't immediately recognize, but it seemed familiar, like something he had seen before, in a dream or a forgotten memory. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and he heard the faint sound of movement, like the creaking of old wood or the shifting of earth. He stood up quickly, his eyes darting around. He wasn't alone anymore. The figures had returned, emerging from the fog, their forms clearer now, their faces hidden beneath hoods. David felt his breath catch in his throat. They were closing in. David's pulse raced as the figures closed in, their movements slow but deliberate, their presence overwhelming. The fog that had once been a distant veil now pressed in on him, thickening around the gates, swirling like a living thing. He could feel their eyes on him, though he couldn't make out their faces. The shadows that draped their forms were more like shapes, outlines of movement that seemed to merge with the mist itself. He stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest, trying to steady his breath. The coldness of the air seemed to seep into his skin, freezing him to the spot. The figures were silent, their feet making no sound on the ground as they slowly encircled him. The ancient hum from the gates returned, vibrating through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. David's mind raced. He needed to leave, to escape whatever dark force had brought him here. But as he turned toward the gate, he realized something horrifying. The gate was no longer just locked. It was sealed, the ironwork twisted and glowing faintly in the mist. The latch had disappeared, as though it had never existed, and the gate was no longer something he could open or escape through. It had become a solid, immovable barrier, keeping him trapped in this strange, oppressive space. He spun around, searching for another way out, but the fog was thick, and the figures were getting closer. They weren't rushing toward him, but their slow, deliberate movements made them seem like an unstoppable force. Their dark hoods obscured their faces, but the more he looked at them, the more he could feel their presence. They were not human, not in any real sense, and the way they moved, synchronized and deliberate, made David's stomach twist. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice breaking as he tried to keep his composure. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't answer. They simply continued their slow march, their eyes hidden beneath their hoods, their movements strange and fluid. One of them, the one at the front, took a step forward, and David instinctively took a step back, his body tensing with fear. The figure stopped a few feet away, its hood still shadowing its face. David could feel the weight of its presence, like a physical pressure pressing against him. The figure raised one hand, pointing directly at him, its long, bony fingers twisting unnaturally. The motion was slow, deliberate, like a signal, but David couldn't make sense of it. The figure spoke, its voice low, a whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You've awakened something," it said, the words chilling David to the core. "You have disturbed the silence that has kept this place hidden." David's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just trying to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking with fear. "I don't belong here. I didn't mean to come. You shouldn't have come," the figure interrupted, its voice colder now, harder. "This place is not meant for the living. You have disturbed what sleeps here, and now it stirs. Now it calls." David's mind reeled as the figure's words sank in. It calls. The chill that had gripped him before seemed to intensify, as though the very air around him had become heavier, colder. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate faintly, as though something deep within the earth was stirring. The hum from the gates grew louder, now accompanied by a deep, resonant sound that seemed to reverberate through his bones. The figure's outstretched hand lowered, and it stepped back, its body melding into the fog. The other figures moved as well, their movements synchronized, as though they were part of a single, unholy entity. David's mind was racing, but his body was frozen, trapped in place by an invisible force. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures stopped. The silence returned, suffocating, and the fog seemed to part slightly, revealing something else. The ground in front of him began to shift, the earth breaking apart like a fissure opening in the ground. A dark, gaping hole appeared in the earth, a void that seemed to pull in the very light around it, as though it were an opening to something far worse. David's breath caught in his throat as the hole seemed to grow, widening until it consumed everything around it. He could feel a pull, a deep gravitational force drawing him toward it. The hum from the gates turned into a low, guttural growl, a sound that felt as though it were coming from the depths of the earth itself. The figures stood motionless, their eyes still hidden, but David could feel their presence pushing him closer to the abyss. They were waiting, as if they knew what would happen next. "No," David whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't. The darkness from the hole grew, extending upward like an impossibly tall shadow. It was moving toward him, and he could hear a voice now, soft, distant, but growing clearer. The voice was ancient, filled with longing and hunger, calling to him from the depths. "You have awakened it," the voice whispered. "You are here because you belong to it. The road to Laurel Bend is closed to you now. You are part of this place." David stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. His hands grasped at the air, but there was no escape. The figures did not move, their eyes still hidden, but their presence was undeniable, suffocating him. He turned, desperate to escape, but the fog was closing in, the hole widening with each passing second. There was no way out. The figures, the hum, the voice, they were all part of this ancient force that ruled over Laurel Bend. He had stepped into something older than he could ever understand, and now there was no leaving. The ground beneath him shifted again, and David could feel the pull of the abyss growing stronger. His body trembled with fear, but his legs refused to move. He was trapped in the fog, trapped by something that had been waiting for him. And now, there was no way to stop it. The figures closed in, their presence swallowing him whole, and the last thing David heard was the voice, soft, insistent, calling him into the darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest as the figures closed in, their hollow, unblinking eyes seeming to watch his every movement. The fog grew denser around him, and the air felt heavier, as if it were thick with something ancient, something powerful that had been waiting for centuries. Every breath he took felt like a weight, the oppressive force of the place seeping into his lungs. The ground beneath his feet shifted again, as though the earth itself was shifting to bind him here. His legs trembled, and he could feel the cold seep deeper into his bones, making his skin prickle with a sense of impending doom. The figures didn't move. But the hum from the gates had turned into something more insistent, more foreboding. A low, guttural sound that vibrated through the air, resonating deep in his chest. David tried to force his legs to move, to run, but they were frozen. He was rooted to the spot, trapped in this eerie, suffocating space. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, though their faces were hidden beneath the folds of their dark hoods. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened, and the air around him felt thick, suffocating. "You cannot leave," a voice whispered, its tone distant but clear. It seemed to come from the very air, the wind itself carrying the words. David's body tensed. The voice was deep, ancient, and cold. It was as though the forest itself had spoken, its voice coming from the depths of the earth. "You have awakened what was dormant. You belong here now." David's mind raced. "No," he thought. "This can't be happening. I need to get out of here. I need to get back to the road." But as his gaze fell on the figures, standing motionless like statues in the thickening fog, he knew there was no escaping this place. He had crossed some threshold, some barrier between the living and the dead, and now it was too late. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, hoping for some signal, some way to contact the outside world. But the screen was blank. The signal was gone, lost somewhere in the thick fog that surrounded him. It was as if the very land had swallowed him whole, severing him from the rest of the world. The fog pressed in tighter, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, like it could crumble at any moment. The figures didn't move, but their presence loomed over him, suffocating him with a sense of inevitability. And then, in the silence that followed, David heard it again, the whispering growing louder. He turned around, his eyes searching for the source, and saw that the ground had shifted once more. The earth cracked, the surface splitting open like a wound. From the crack, something ancient began to rise. It was a figure, but not like the ones that had surrounded him. This figure was taller, darker, its form obscured by the swirling fog. It seemed to be made of the very shadows that filled the air, a mass of darkness and smoke that moved with purpose. As it rose from the ground, the figures around David stepped back, forming a circle, as though they were waiting for something. The hum grew louder, more intense, and the air grew colder. David's breath caught in his throat as the figure fully emerged from the crack in the earth. It was no longer just a shadow. It was solid, a hulking mass of darkness that towered over him. The figure had no face, no recognizable features, only a swirling void where its face should have been. It was an entity older than time, something that had existed long before the world had been shaped, and now it stood before him, its presence like a weight on his chest, pressing him into the ground. "You have disturbed the silence," the figure intoned, its voice deep and reverberating. "You have trespassed on the sacred land of Laurel Bend. Now, you will stay." David stumbled backward, his mind racing for some way out of this. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like it could collapse at any moment. The figure's form swirled, growing more distinct as it stepped closer, and the fog thickened around it, like a living cloak. "No," David managed to say, his voice hoarse, shaking with fear. "I didn't mean to. I just needed to fix the road." The figure's presence loomed over him, the air growing even colder. "The road was never meant to be fixed," the figure replied, its voice like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "It was meant to be forgotten." David looked around, his pulse racing. The figures had stepped back, but they were still watching him. The atmosphere grew heavier, suffocating. The figure moved closer, its body swirling with shadows that seemed to leak into the very air, blotting out the dim light that had filtered through the trees. "You cannot leave, David. You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice now a low growl like the sound of thunder rolling through the sky. "You are part of this place now, part of the land that holds the lost." David's body trembled, and he staggered backward, his mind a blur of panic. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was look at the figure as it towered over him, the dark void that was its face reflecting the fear in his eyes. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and David's legs gave way beneath him. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the figure loomed closer, its form growing ever larger. Then, the ground beneath him began to shift once more, cracking open wider. The earth seemed to come alive, like a living, breathing thing that had been awakened from a long slumber. David tried to crawl away, but the ground seemed to pull him in, dragging him closer to the opening in the earth. He reached out, grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The figures moved, slowly but deliberately, stepping closer, forming a circle around him. The figure that had risen from the earth stood before him, blocking his escape. "You belong to Laurel Bend now," it intoned, its voice filling the air like a dark, ancient chant. "The fog will guide you, and you will never leave." David's vision blurred, and as the last vestiges of his strength slipped away, the earth seemed to swallow him whole. The fog closed in around him, and the last thing he saw was the figure's dark void where its face should have been, staring down at him with ancient, unyielding eyes. Lena had always been drawn to the quiet corners of the world, places where few ventured and fewer still stayed. It was the solitude she craved, away from the hustle of her city life, away from the endless noise and constant demands. So when she found the listing for a small cabin in Shadow Notch, a secluded spot deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect retreat. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace and quiet. The journey to the cabin had been long, winding through dense forest roads that felt like they belonged to another time, another place. Her GPS had failed as soon as she passed the last small town, leaving her to navigate by a hand-drawn map she had found online. She didn't mind the challenge. In fact, she relished it. This was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to unwind, clear her mind, and leave the pressures of her life behind. When she finally arrived, the cabin appeared exactly as described, small but cozy, nestled among tall, towering trees, with a quaint stone fireplace and a large porch that overlooked a sprawling valley. It was picturesque, almost idyllic. A small stream ran nearby, its gentle babbling adding to the peaceful atmosphere. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Lena unpacked her things and settled inside. The wooden floors creaked beneath her feet, and the smell of pine and fresh wood filled the air. Everything was simple and rustic, but there was something comforting about it. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. That evening, as Lena sat by the fire reading a book, the silence around her seemed almost too thick. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the cabin. She had expected this kind of solitude, but now that she was alone in the woods, a creeping unease began to settle in. She shrugged it off. It was just the isolation. After a long day of driving, it was probably the quiet playing tricks on her. But then, just as the evening deepened into night, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the door. Lena froze, her book forgotten in her lap. The sound was too deliberate to be the wind, too rhythmic. It wasn't an animal either, too consistent, too purposeful. She stood, moving toward the door cautiously, her heart beginning to race. She peered out the small window next to the door but saw nothing, just the darkness of the forest surrounding her, the thick trees pressing in on all sides. She shook her head, telling herself it was probably just a branch brushing against the door in the wind. She had heard of such things before. The isolation played tricks on your mind, especially at night. But as she turned to return to her seat by the fire, she heard it again. This time louder. A distinct scratching at the door. It was unmistakable, and it was coming from the inside. Lena's blood ran cold. She froze in place, staring at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes flicked to the fireplace, the warmth of the fire offering no comfort against the chill that now gripped her. She had to be hearing things. There was no one else here. She was alone. The scratching continued, now joined by another sound, faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. She strained to hear them, but the words were muffled, indecipherable. Her mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but all she could think was that there was something in the cabin with her. Without thinking, she moved to the door and threw it open, the night air rushing in, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. She looked around frantically, but there was no one. The forest was still and silent. No one. But the whispers persisted, growing clearer, closer. Lena stepped out into the darkness, her senses heightened, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The wind had picked up, and the trees loomed above her like dark sentinels. The forest seemed to close in on her, the night alive with shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. She scanned the area, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispers seemed to be coming from the direction of the stream, faint but distinct, like hushed voices carried on the breeze. The longer she stood there, the more the whispers seemed to grow louder, as if beckoning her forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no reply, just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the gloom. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she squinted to make out the details. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, draped in a dark cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, and its body was still, motionless, like a statue. Lena took a step forward, her pulse racing. She had to know who or what it was, but before she could take another step, the figure disappeared into the trees. "Wait!" Lena shouted, instinctively taking a step toward the spot where the figure had stood, but the forest seemed to swallow it up, the darkness consuming everything. The whispers intensified, the voices growing louder, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, chilling laugh that made Lena's skin crawl. Suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if something was stirring beneath the earth. The air grew colder, the fog thickening around her, and the shadows that surrounded her seemed to move. Lena's breath quickened as she turned back toward the cabin. She needed to get inside. She needed to lock the door, shut out whatever was lurking in the darkness. She ran, her feet pounding against the ground, her mind screaming at her to get back inside. But the fog was closing in, the whispers now a constant presence in her ears, the chilling laughter reverberating in the air around her. She reached the cabin, her hand shaking as she grabbed the door handle. But the door wouldn't open. The latch was stuck, frozen in place. Lena yanked at the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but it refused to budge. The whispers grew louder, closer. The laughter echoed in her ears, filling her mind with terror. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the same one she had seen by the trees, but now it was closer. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, its face hidden beneath the dark hood. The figure was taller than before, its body seeming to stretch unnaturally, as though it was made of the very darkness around it. Lena screamed, her mind spiraling with fear, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and the whispers grew louder still. "Welcome to Shadow Notch," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "The whispers have been waiting for you." Lena's pulse thudded in her ears as the figure in the doorway took another step forward. Her body went cold with fear, her hands trembling as she tried to force the door open. But it wouldn't move. The latch was stuck, the wood splintering beneath her frantic attempts. She could hear the soft rasping of the figure's breath, deep and slow, like the sound of an old tree creaking in the wind. The laughter from the shadows had stopped, replaced by a deep silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The fog had thickened, pressing against the windows of the cabin like a living thing, and the whispers had grown louder, now circling her head. Their words indecipherable, but somehow familiar. "You can't escape," the figure murmured, its voice low and echoing, as if coming from somewhere deep within the earth. "You belong here, with us." Lena backed away from the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. She stumbled across the room, her eyes flicking between the figure and the shadowy corners of the cabin. She needed to find a way out. There had to be a way. But as she reached the window, she saw only the thick fog pressing against it. The outline of trees blurred in the distance, their shapes shifting like ghostly silhouettes. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer as it moved into the dim light of the cabin. The hooded cloak it wore was tattered, its edges frayed and torn, but the air around it seemed to warp and bend, as if the figure was made of darkness itself. Its face, hidden beneath the hood, was nothing more than a black void, the shadows swirling where its features should have been. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a low, inhuman hum. Lena could feel them in her bones, vibrating through her, trying to reach inside her mind, to pull her into the depths of the darkness. She pressed her hands to her ears, her chest tightening with fear. She needed to think, to figure out what to do next. The figure didn't move. It stood still in the doorway, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight, as if the very air was heavy with the power it exuded. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Lena managed to choke out, her voice breaking with terror. She could barely speak, the words scraping at her throat as she forced them out. "What do you want from me?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering her question. Then, its voice, slow and chilling, filled the space. "See, we are the keepers of this place," it said. "We watch over those who wander too far into Shadow Notch. You crossed the boundary, Lena. You didn't just come here. You were called. And now you will remain." Lena's eyes widened, her mind racing. Called? She hadn't heard of anyone being called to this place. Shadow Notch was a forgotten area, a myth spoken of in hushed tones, its existence dismissed as just a part of local legend. Yet somehow, she had been drawn to it. She had been pulled into its depths without even knowing why. The figure stepped forward again, its form shifting and swirling in the mist, its cloak trailing like smoke. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, urging her to surrender, to give in. She could feel her resolve slipping away, the oppressive presence of the figure and the cabin closing in around her. "No," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "I won't stay. I won't belong to this place." The figure's laugh was soft, cold, and unfeeling, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across an abandoned street. It reached up with one long, bony hand, and the air seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping instantly, as if the figure's touch could freeze time itself. "You have no choice," the figure said. "You are already part of the story. The cabin, the fog, the whispers, they are all tied to you now." Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her mind spiraling into panic. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let this place claim her. But every instinct told her the same thing. She was trapped. The whispers grew louder, their voices now a chant, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to pulse from the very walls of the cabin. With a final surge of desperation, Lena bolted toward the back door, but as her hand reached for the handle, she froze. The figure's voice stopped her cold, its words slipping into her mind like a whisper in the wind. "There is no escape from the notch," it said. "We will keep you, as we have kept so many others. You will join them, those who came before you. You will be another lost soul in the fog." The door to the cabin slammed shut before she could touch the handle. Lena spun around, her heart racing, her eyes wide with fear. She was trapped. She had to be. The figure in the doorway, the whispers, the fog, they were all part of the same dark force that controlled this place. But then, something changed. The shadows in the cabin seemed to shift. The floor creaked, the walls groaned, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw something moving in the corner of the room. A figure, a silhouette. It was another person. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the figure moved out of the corner, slowly, deliberately. This time, it wasn't cloaked in shadow. It was a woman, her face pale and ghostly, her clothes tattered as if she had been trapped here for years. The woman's eyes met Lena's, and there was a flicker of recognition. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed toward the window, her hand trembling. The gesture was clear. She was urging Lena to look. Lena's eyes darted toward the window, but as she did, the fog seemed to grow thicker. She saw only shadows, vague shapes moving in the distance. The woman's eyes were wide with panic, her mouth moving as though she were speaking, but the words didn't reach Lena. Then, the fog parted just enough for Lena to see it. A large shape looming beyond the trees, a dark mass standing at the edge of the forest. It was moving closer, slowly, relentlessly, and Lena realized, with a sickening jolt, that whatever it wasn't going to stop. Lena's heart pounded as the woman in the cabin's corner pointed toward the window. Her wide, frightened eyes locked onto Lena's. The figure was pale, ghostly, as if she had been trapped in this place for longer than Lena could comprehend. She looked desperate, her hands trembling as she motioned for Lena to look outside. The fog, thick and oppressive, parted just enough to reveal a massive shape looming at the edge of the trees. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark silhouette against the mist, but as it moved closer, the details became clearer. It was tall, impossibly so, towering over the trees, its form shifting like a shadow that had taken on substance. The shape seemed to pulse with a life of its own, undulating with a disturbing rhythm, as if it were breathing. Lena's breath caught in her throat, and she stepped back from the window, her pulse quickening. She had no idea what she was seeing, what that thing was. It wasn't human or anything she recognized. Its presence made the air feel heavier, as if the weight of its existence pressed down on everything around it. The woman in the cabin made a low, desperate sound, a kind of choked sob, and then raised her hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back a scream. Her wide, terrified eyes never left Lena's face, urging her to understand the danger that was coming closer. "What? What is that?" Lena whispered, her voice shaking as she looked back at the woman. The ghostly figure's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she shook her head violently, her hair falling around her face, as if whatever words she had were trapped inside her, unable to escape. Lena turned back to the window, her body frozen in place as the towering silhouette grew closer, moving with an unnatural slowness. It was no longer just outside. It was almost at the edge of the cabin's yard, looming above the trees like a monster, its shape shifting and reforming as though it were not bound by the laws of nature. The whispers from the shadows in the cabin had grown louder, swirling around her like a storm. They were no longer distant murmurs. They were a chorus of voices, urgent, pleading, and full of dread. Lena could hear snippets of words that didn't make sense at first. "It's coming. It won't stop. You must leave." But then one word stood out, clear and chilling. "Run!" Lena stumbled backward, her mind racing. Run. She had to run. The figure outside was closing in, and whatever it wasn't something she wanted to face. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, the need to escape pushing her forward. But when she looked toward the door, she saw it. The door, the one she had left open earlier, was now shut. The latch had slammed closed with an unnatural force, as though something had blocked her exit. She ran toward it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart raced, and her breath became shallow as the figure outside came closer, its presence filling the entire cabin with an overwhelming sense of terror. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with panic. But no answer came. The door remained locked, and the figure outside loomed larger with every passing second. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, now frantic, desperate. Lena spun around, her mind spinning. The ghostly woman in the corner was no longer standing still. She had taken a step toward Lena, her movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she raised her hands as though reaching for something just beyond Lena's grasp. "It's too late," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. She opened her mouth as if to say more, but all that came out was a soft, rattling breath. The sound was like the wind rustling through dead leaves, hollow, empty. The woman's body seemed to shudder, her limbs twitching as if she were fading, losing her grip on the physical world. Then, with a soft, mournful gasp, she collapsed to the floor, her body dissolving into the air, leaving only a faint mist behind. Lena screamed, stumbling backward into the center of the room, her hands clutching at her chest, her heart racing. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The woman had vanished, the whispers had stopped, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the distant thud of footsteps outside, the slow, steady pace of something massive moving closer. The figure outside was almost at the cabin now. Lena had to move. She had to get out. She turned toward the window, but before she could reach it, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she fumbled for her flashlight, but it was useless. The cabin was pitch black, and then she heard it, a soft, scratching sound, followed by a slow, deliberate thump, like the heavy footfalls of something immense. The shadow outside pressed against the cabin, and the air grew even colder. She could feel it now, a suffocating presence pressing against the walls of the cabin. Something was out there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. Lena grabbed the edge of the nearest table, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her body was frozen, her mind torn between the need to escape and the terrifying certainty that the creature outside was already too close. Another loud thump. This time, the door shuddered. It was as if whatever it was outside had slammed into it with its full weight. The entire cabin trembled. Lena's body surged with fear, and she bolted toward the back door, the only way she could see out. She grabbed the handle and twisted, praying it would open. But the door wouldn't move. It was stuck, as if something was holding it shut. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. This time, they were clearer. "Don't go outside," the voices said. "It's waiting for you." The thumping stopped. Everything went still. Lena's mind screamed, urging her to leave, to push through whatever force was keeping her trapped in this cursed cabin. But as she turned around, she saw it. The figure, taller than any man, its form shifting like smoke, stood in the doorway, and for the first time, it spoke. "Will you belong to Shadow Notch now?"